Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode of the Nutrition UI series, we're going to continue styling our article and aside sections, getting as far as we can with the layout across all breakpoints. If you recall in the last episode, we finished out by getting our related article cards styled. Next up, let's focus on the mobile-first styling of our section selector. If we reference our Figma design, you'll recall that we have the section selector section above the related articles, since visually it's tucked up right next to the article itself. And at desktop, we're going to reverse that order and have the related article show first, but we can experiment with different breakpoints in between to see what works best visually. The first thing we need to do is go into our index.html file. I'm going to scroll pretty far down here, and we're going to target the layout of this section here. So let's give this section a class name. This is part of the aside, but let's make it its own block. So we'll call it section selector. And what we'll want to do for mobile is have the previous and next arrows wrapped around the section number and vertically center everything inside. So taking a look at our live preview, let's inspect this page, open up our responsive design mode. Let's scroll all the way down, and we're going to handle the overall arrangement of the section selector in just a minute, but let's get the styling within that section handled. So the first thing we're going to do in our app.css, go all the way to the bottom of our file, add a new section comment. Let's call this the section selector. And as always with responsive design, let's start out by wrapping these in a media query. So we'll say max width of 575 pixels. We'll target our new class name section selector. We know that we're going to want to use display flex to align the child items. So we'll set that to be align items center. Let's make sure that the flex flow is actually set to row and no wrap. Give that a quick save. Okay, things are looking pretty decent here. What we'll want to do from here is actually change the order of the elements so that the previous button is the first element to appear on the left. So let's go ahead and start giving class names to each of the child elements inside of this section. So for this first one, we're going to have the class of section selector, and this would be our section number. Next up, we have our two button icons. So this would be section selector previous, and then section selector next. Give that a save, go into our app.css, start targeting these elements here. So with Flexbox, there's a property called order, and I believe this is what we need to apply to our previous button. So let's select that and give it an order of 0. See what happens here. And we might have to target the remaining elements inside of this section to get those orders working as expected. So we'll grab our section selector number. Set the order to 1. And then we'll copy our previous selector down. Let's update this to be next. And change the order of that to 3. Okay, so it looks like that is not taking effect. Let's give this an inspection, see if we can figure out what's going on here. So one thing I'm noticing is we have the wrong class name for our section number. Let's get that updated, give it a save. Okay, now things are laying out as expected. We want this to fill up the fully available width. So let's make sure we say justify content, and this will be space between. That's looking correct on that end. Let's double check our design for reference. It looks like we do want those to just grow to whatever available width is there. So this is looking correct on our end. Next up, for smaller breakpoints, let's handle the overall sequence within this aside to get the section selector appearing above. So let's find our aside section here. And this will also be in a media query. So we'll say a max width of 575. We might adjust this further as always, but let's just get this in as a start. So we'll want this to also be display flex, and the flex direction is going to be column. If we give that a save, nothing should really change at this point. But what we actually want for this part of the layout is to say that's column reverse, and this will flip the arrangement of these two items. With the section selector up top now, let's make sure we have the correct vertical spacing between those elements. So we'll drill into our design files here. We have our article selector, and it looks like we have 32 pixels of margin bottom below that section. So with if we close out our search here, you can actually scroll down further. And with our section selector, we're going to add a margin bottom of space double. Give that a save. Now the spacing looks correct there. Let's also make sure that we have overall spacing before the end of the page. So if we reference our designs once more, I believe we have space double down here. Taking a look at our cards, by default, we have space default on the bottom of the second card. And we probably don't want that, so let's make sure that in our card section above, if we scroll up further, that we only apply this margin bottom to the first child. So in both of these media queries, we're going to want to add a new block, and we'll say card first child. Open that up, and then we can go into our selector block and move these margin bottoms down. Give that a save. So now we should have, let's see what's going on here. We'd expect this margin to appear only on the first card, but let's see what's going on. And if we look in our inspector tools, we see that the first child pseudo selector isn't being applied. So I think what we might need in this case actually is first of type. Let's give this a save and see if that works. Okay, that seems to correct our issue, so the wrong pseudo selector in that case. Let's make sure that the aside provides that margin bottom that we're looking for this layout. So we'll scroll back up to our side. And at this media query, let's apply that margin bottom of space double. Give that a save. Now we should have sufficient margin below that section as a whole. Things are starting to shape up here. Now, one thing that will be interesting with this aside section is as we increase the viewport size, is figuring out at what point we want the section selector and these cards to sit side by side or vary up this layout in some other manner. One thing I'm seeing is we probably don't want these arrows to go too far apart, so that way they still feel associated with the current section number. So we might want to control for that. Let's also investigate to see at what point we want these to be completely side by side, or even switching over to our desktop layout where the section numbers go vertical, and then the order of the related articles and section selector get reversed again. So let's just try some things out and see how we feel at different breakpoints. First off, we cap this at 575 for that first layout. I think probably maybe even until we go to that desktop layout around 1200 pixels, we'll want to keep that direction reversed. So let's adjust our media query accordingly. If we scroll back down, and because I think we want to retain this overall layout, we can just adapt this existing media query to go up to 1199. One thing I'm seeing is we should actually break this out into separate blocks per selector, since we might be adding additional styles. So I'm going to copy this media query, and we'll just paste it in for each of these blocks, add closing curl braces to each of these, and get the right spacing between blocks. So this layout should hold true all the way up to 1199. One thing we need to do is on our side, we need to make sure that the column reverse holds up to this breakpoint as well. So scrolling back up to our side, again, we're kind of bouncing back and forth just as we adjust things, get a feel for what's needed. So at some point, I think what I'd like to see is these two cards go side by side when there's enough room for them. So we have 16 pixel gap. These will be 288 each with a 16 pixel gutter. And as things go really wide, we'll have to see if we still want everything pinned to the left or if we want to center it in the viewport. I think to stay consistent with our article, let's pin it to the left, and that'll inform us on when we should actually have these two aside sections laid out next to each other. So in order to do that, let's give a max width to our section selector, which I believe in our mobile mockup is also at that 288. So we're going to go back down to these lower breakpoints. this section selector is going to have a max width of 28.8 rems. Give that a save. So now that will always be to the side. And we might be able to bring in CSS Grid here to basically create auto columns of this fixed width, and it will allow us to lay out things accordingly. But we're just going to have to keep playing around with these different layout options, see what feels best. This is a good example where it may make sense if you're working with the designer or if you are the designer yourself to go back to your mockups, kind of play around with some visual options and establish some in-between mockups when you don't have enough information to go off of. So because we go directly from mobile to desktop, it might be nice to kind of handle this tablet or so breakpoint, just because we're noticing that we need a little bit more layout consideration here. But if you are both the designer and the developer, it's up to you if you want to basically prototype this in code or use your design tool as kind of the decision-making place. In this case, I think we'll keep playing around with code a little bit. And if we feel like we're still not informed, let's go back to Figma to feel out these options. So my first sort of guess here is that we might want these cards to be side by side underneath this section number. And if the width allows to have all three on one row. I'm not sure about kind of the in-between there, but let's just get a feel. So up in our related articles section, we just have our card, and its layout is being handled by its parent section, which I believe at this point doesn't actually have a selector on it. So let's go ahead and call this related articles. And basically we just want this to have a flex layout. So we'll add a selector here for related articles. Make sure this is within that same media query. So max width of 1199 pixels. Move our block inside. And we're going to want this to be display flex. It'll naturally break to a new line with flexbox. So let's just say that the flex direction is row. We'll want to retain that wrapping. We give this a save. Let's see what's going on in our section, because we should have plenty of room here. Oh, and it looks like our media query has the wrong breakpoint. So now we should see that spacing come into effect. One thing we want to do is once they are able to wrap, we're going to want that gutter between them, and to also take off the margin bottom we applied to the first card. So with our calculator here, we have 16 pixels left margin plus 288 card, another 16 pixel gutter, another 288 card, and finally 16 pixels right margin. So the 624 breakpoint is where we should have enough space for this layout to work. So let's target that as a media query to take off the margin bottom and apply a margin left on the second card. Another option here is to simply bring in a, similar to our nutrition information section, a CSS grid layout, and that'll give us a little bit more explicit control over the gutter. So I might want to play around with that. So we know our breakpoint is 624, is going to be our min width in which this will come into play. So let's actually say at a min width of 624, if I can type this out. And then we'll go to a max width of 1199. We're actually going to want this to be display grid. We're going to have grid template columns. It's going to be 28.8 rems twice. And then our grid gap will be the space default. Give that a save. This is looking good. And if we go any lower than this, it should just break to that new line. Let's make sure we also take away that margin bottom at the same breakpoint on our first card. So we'll scroll down. So this margin bottom will actually only be applied up to 623. And then we'll bring back a margin bottom once they're vertically stacked again at 1200. So we're going to make an in-between media query here. So we'll say at a max width of 623 pixels, and move this particular selector into that block. Give that a save. So now we should have the correct spacing at all breakpoints. It's looking pretty good. I think at this point, we're actually good retaining this layout up to 1200. Let's play around a little bit and see if we still like it at some of these pretty large breakpoints. And it looks like we have a bit of visual consistency here. One thing I'm noticing is that we don't actually have our left and right margins applied at these larger breakpoints to the overall layout, so we still need to address that. That might give us a better idea of if we like how this layout looks so far. So I think this would just be coming from our main. It looks like we have padding left and right that are just going to a max width of 1199. And instead, what we'll want to do is match the header's padding of space oct, which happens at a min width of 1024 pixels and then remains consistent from there. So again, we're jumping around quite a bit at this stage, and that's necessary to really get dedicated layout working in the context of all of your surrounding components. So it's pretty common at this stage. It seems a little bit chaotic, but it's really helpful and beneficial actually to keep kind of iterating above the surrounding layout until we can confirm that things are working as expected, instead of going down too far any path with assumptions that may not hold up once we get everything else styled. So in our media, we have a max width of 1189. This will actually be at 1024. Let's copy this block down. And this will be at a min width of 1025. The padding right and left will go up to space oct. Give that a save. Now everything should line up visually with our global header. And I think we are good retaining this layout as we see it all the way up to 1199. So we'll go up to that breakpoint. And this is the point where we want to introduce our styling for the section selector. Our cards are already looking good here, but we need to change the section selector to be this vertical layout that's centered within the column. So again, going back down, our section selector all the way at the bottom here, we're going to want to duplicate this block and change this to be min width of 1200 pixels. At this point, I'm going to take the margin bottom off because I want the main section to provide that instead, which actually is maybe the way we should be handling the margin in general. So just to clean that up and have it be a really consistent implementation, we'll cut this out. Again, find our main, and this is something that'll actually hold true up to that max width of 1200 pixels. So we'll want to bring in the media query of 1199, target main, apply this to the bottom, and we can go back to our section selector, clean this up a bit. At a min width of 1200, I believe our CSS Grid Layout will handle the width. So we can actually just say this will always be a width of 100%. Give that a save. Let's pull up our code preview here. So we're going to want to arrange these elements vertically in a column. So this will actually be a column flex layout now. So flex, let's just say direction because we don't need to control the flow in this case, will be column. And then the order of the elements, if we reference our design, looks correct, but what we're gonna have to do is trade out the icons accordingly. So let's real quick get our margins established, and then we'll focus on trading out these SVGs across different breakpoints. So inspecting our side for our desktop layout, let's drill into our article selector, grab that number, and see what the margin between them is. Yes, this is supposed to be 64 pixels. This current layout doesn't account for the tap target sizes, but our code will. But we know that the section number should have 64 pixels beneath it. So we'll grab our media query for that particular class name and update it to be min width 1200. The order in this case, I don't think will be needed, so we can get rid of that. Let's say the margin bottom, however, is going to be that space oct. Give that a save. It's looking pretty large, so we might actually want to revise that a bit. And another thing I'm noticing is it looks like we have 64 pixel margin between the related articles in this section, so we'll handle that as well at this point. So instead of 64 pixels, let's try space double. Again, we're accounting for the tap target size of those icons, so this might actually be a little truer to the intent of the design. Now between each of these selectors, looks like we have a similar thing. Let's say 32 because we have extra space around these icons to account for the tap targets. So we'll say our previous selector at this breakpoint, we shouldn't need order yet again. Min width of 1200. And the margin bottom will be the same as above. So that'll be space double. If that is save, check things out. That looks like enough spacing really for everything to be comfortable. One thing we want to address now is the spacing between the articles, the related articles, and our section number. So scrolling up to our related articles at a min width of 1200 yet again. The related articles are going to have a margin bottom of space oct. And we'll see how we feel about that as we evaluate this at different breakpoints. For now, that's looking good. One thing I'm noticing is our padding seems to be way off here. So let's see what's going on there. I think this might be due to our CSS Grid Layout that already accounts for the gutters we need. And that comes into play at a min width of 1200. Let's see why that padding is still coming into play. Oh, it's because we didn't encapsulate that 1025 on main. So let's make sure that this goes to a max width of 1199, and that should solve this layout issue here. Okay, everything's looking much better now. So last thing for this episode, let's turn our attention to swapping out these SVGs as needed. And if we look at our HTML, we can see what SVGs we're currently using here. So in our section selector, we can close out our search here. We have these 40 pixel square icons, which I believe correlates to the large icons in our design. Let's just double check that real quick. Yep, so you can see that these particular ones, the caret up large, down large, left and right, are all the same icon. They're just positioned as needed. We could use a transform to rotate these, but it's such a simple thing to just implement a dedicated SVG in this case that I think we're just going to stick with that implementation. So let's go into our assets here. Let's grab our icons. We have up large, grab that, copy it into our code. This will be for our previous selector. We'll paste it after our mobile first version. Do the same with the down large variation for the next selector. And we'll add a class to each of these. We'll say class. They're still going to need the same button icon class. And while we're at it, let's make sure we add the role of presentation yet again. One thing we'll need for these icons is classes to trade them out based on the viewport. So still on these up and down variations, let's say that this is the section selector icon. And this one in particular would be for desktop. So let's say that. We can copy this same class name up into our smaller SVGs, paste it in, and replace desktop with mobile. So we'll give that a save. Go all the way to the bottom of our CSS file once more. So we'll add the max width media query as well as the min width media query from above for another class. You can copy this down. And instead of saying previous, we'll want section selector icon. Let's start with mobile. So this will be display none on those larger sizes. And then actually this will be desktop for the smaller sizes. We'll target that and say display none. And I think that should be all we need here. So let's verify. Yep, we have the up and down icons at this breakpoint. Let's reduce the viewport size down. Trades out for the left and right. That's looking good. And since these are distinct blocks, we actually want a space between those just to keep everything well organized. Let's verify our work real quick. Things are looking good across all breakpoints. And now I think we're well set up to handle the final layout of our article section, and that'll complete the styling phase of our project. So thanks again for watching. Check out the next episode where we finish out the article layout and do any fine tuning of our styling to finish out the styling section of this project.